Was that disinformation to say that these amendments would ban legitimately used hunting rifles and shotguns?
I do not believe that it was disinformation to state that. It's simply a matter of fact.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you for having invited me today.
Firearms officer, I have a dual mandate to supervise Firearms Act licensing in Alberta, as other CFOs do, but also to work relentlessly for a more principled firearms program in Canada. Since assuming this role, I have made safety number one. This means rejecting trendy solutions and focusing on the work that will truly make a difference. Part of that work is ensuring responsible, law-abiding firearms owners in Alberta understand all the laws and regulations they face. I therefore regularly engage with members of Alberta's vibrant firearms community. In 2021-22 alone, I attended well over 50 events and met with thousands of Albertans. Excuse me. Time and again, I hear that confidence in Canada's firearms control system has eroded. That confidence is an essential element in building safer communities. If we want people to go beyond legal minimums and proactively contribute to public safety, they must feel heard and respected. Even after the withdrawal of G4 and G46, Bill C-21 continues to undermine confidence in our firearms control system while contributing nothing to reducing the violent misuse of firearms. Bill C-21 is based on a fundamentally flawed premise. Prohibiting specific types of firearms is not an effective way of improving public safety. It will waste billions of taxpayer dollars that could have been used on more effective approaches, such as enforcement of firearms prohibition orders, reinforcing the border, or combating the drug trade and gang activity. The ban on most handgun transfers and the Order in Council prohibitions of May 2020 have had a devastating impact on the assets of hundreds of thousands of Canadians. With strokes of a pen, billions of dollars worth of legally acquired property was rendered unsaleable. The scope of C-21 is absurdly broad. The ban on handgun transfers includes even single-shot muzzle-loading flintlocks and percussion revolvers and pistols, as well as precious historical artifacts and family heirlooms. The loss of the sales of handguns and potentially almost all popular modern rifle designs threatens the survival of many multi-generational family firearms businesses. Gun shows, which are often a major social event and economic contributor in struggling small communities, are also being hard hit. The survival of many long-established, reputable shooting sports has been threatened. The competitions put on by these organizations bring visitors that support the economic viability of small communities. Without new entrants, these sports will atrophy and die. Over time, C-21's prohibitions will also undermine the economic viability of the shooting ranges Canadians rely on for a safe, well-regulated place to shoot. These ranges are not only where hunters go to sight in their hunting rifles, but also where police and others who require firearms for their jobs go to train. Many things could have been done to lessen the collateral damage of Bill C-21. The firearms targeted for prohibition could have been made restricted and their numbers capped. Or, if these guns are prohibited, the cost to the taxpayer and the impact on property rights could have been reduced by grandfathering them and allowing full transferability among licensed Canadians. Shooting sports could have been safeguarded by allowing the chief firearms officer of each province to designate which sport shooting organizations in his or her province can write letters allowing carefully vetted individuals access to sporting exemptions. Provisions could also have been included to address the real issues around illegal firearms. 3D printing alone could easily supply the entire demand for illegal firearms across Canada before long. Regulating 3D printing without destroying new industries like video game development will require new and smarter approaches. The fact that Bill C-21 does not include any such damage reduction measures reinforces the conclusion that the goal of this bill is demonstratively not about public safety, but an attempt to destroy long-established communities of law-abiding firearms owners across the country by targeting their property. These are the people who perform a vital public service by socializing new firearms owners into responsible firearms use. They are the allies, not the enemies of public safety. I urge you to recommend the withdrawal of Bill C-21 in its entirety, or at least to allow amendments to reduce its collateral damage. Strengthening public safety is hard enough. Please don't allow Bill C-21 to make it harder. Merci. Je serai heureuse de répondre à vos questions.
Thank you, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Doctor.
For that. My next question is for Dr. Bryant. We already have a classification system in Canada. We have non-restricted, we have restricted, there are prohibited firearms. Isn't it true, Dr. Bryant, that every single firearm that is used by civilians in Canada has to be approved by the RCMP? Isn't that correct, Dr. Bryant?
I believe so, yes.
So for some people to say that these firearms, semi-automatic hunting rifles and shotguns, are not legitimate for civilian use, the RCMP has approved these for legitimate civilian use. That is correct?
In fact, in the case of many restricted firearms, the individual was specifically authorized to acquire that specific firearm for a sporting purpose.
Interesting. Dr. Bryant, I already believe we have an evergreen definition in Canada. As we said, we have non-restricted, we have restricted, and we have prohibited. And these are based on functional capabilities of firearms, wouldn't you say? It's not based upon how the firearm looks. It's based upon what the firearm is capable of. Isn't that correct?
There is certainly an element of that, although I think there are a great many logical inconsistencies in the way that we have categorized, particularly the definition between, for example, restricted and prohibited firearms. Many of those are sort of more a matter of historical accident and political compromises than any actual intent. So there are firearms that are completely useless for any violent purpose, but are categorized in the highest category. So what I'm saying is, in general, there are many things that are put into the higher categories that probably shouldn't be there.
Now, would you say in your experience that when the RCMP is reviewing a firearm to be classified in Canada, that they probably, or in almost all cases, err on the side of being more restrictive or less restrictive in their classification of those firearms?
I would say overall much more restrictive.
Okay. And when we're talking about the evergreen definition that the Liberals put forward in the amendments we're discussing today, semi-automatic centerfire rifles and shotguns that have the capability of accepting a magazine over 5 cartridges for the type that the gun was originally designed for. In your vast experience with firearms, this amendment would cover a wide variety of commonly used rifles, hunting rifles and shotguns. Isn't that correct?
I believe so, yes. In fact, I have, to give one example, Model 1907 Winchester was designed in 1907, produced from 1907 on, had a 5-shot capacity, but later some magazines were made that did have higher capacities, and this gun, which was explicitly designed for medium game shooting like deer, well over 100 years ago, could well be covered.
Do you think, as some people have said, that concerns about these Liberal amendments and their impact on hunting rifles and shotguns was an act of blatant disinformation? Like, was that disinformation to say that these amendments would ban legitimately used hunting rifles and shotguns?
I do not believe that it was disinformation to state that. I believe it was simply a matter of fact. Many firearms that I know, I have friends who have used them personally for deer hunting for many years, would be covered.
Dr. Bryant, I'd like to start with you. I'm going to assume that in your role in Alberta, you have also taken the time to travel to Indigenous communities and have also consulted with them on this issue. Can you confirm that?
So we currently have an initiative headed by one of my staff members that will be doing additional outreach to Indigenous communities, but many of the events that I attend are held in areas that are close to Indigenous communities and are heavily attended by Indigenous people. So I do speak frequently with Indigenous firearms owners at those events, although not as organized groups.
Thank you, because that leads to my next question. I mean, in the previous Parliament, we passed Bill C-15, which essentially is requiring the Government of Canada through consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, to take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada, laws passed in our federal parliament, are consistent with the declaration. Now, I believe it was in December, the Assembly of First Nations, they passed an emergency resolution by consensus, and they specifically identified Article 5, Article 18, Article 34, and Article 39, where they felt C-21 was contravening those parts of the declaration. And, I've spoken to the Indigenous members of my caucus who have said that to have an emergency resolution at the AFN passed by consensus is virtually unheard of. So obviously that consultation had not taken place before C-21, before I should say the amendments to C-21 were introduced. And I don't think we get enough Indigenous voices heard here in Ottawa. And that is a disservice. It goes against the principle of a nation-to-nation relationship. It goes against the principle of Bill C-15 that was passed into law. And I just want to hear from you, Dr. Bryant, because the Indigenous members of my caucus, Indigenous communities across Canada, have repeatedly said that these amendments affect firearms that are tools. And I think particularly in the North, my colleague Lori Idlout, she's the member for Nunavut, and she said that, when you're face to face with a polar bear, you can't be equipped with a bolt action rifle. There is an absolute need for a rifle that can discharge in a semi-automatic manner. And I just want to hear from you, are you hearing the same thing from Indigenous communities? Can you report back to this committee what some of their concerns have been over this process? Because I think that's an important voice that needs to be added to this conversation to provide that important context.
Agree that not only Indigenous but also non-Indigenous individuals who may confront dangerous predatory animals in the wilderness may have a need for rapid follow-up shots. In fact, there are quite a number of other situations where rapid follow-up shots are required, for example, in the control of feral pigs, which is an increasing problem in agricultural areas of Alberta. So there definitely is a need for that capacity. I would also point out that many of the firearms that would have been affected, so for example, the SKS rifle, which has been used for hunting in a great many situations, particularly by hunters on a budget. The reason why that particular firearm has been very popular is because it was very cheap. At one point, you could get one for $89. And so to be able to have a hunting rifle capable of taking reasonable deer and to have multiple follow-up shots if they're necessary for the control of a dangerous animal for that low a price led to its very widespread sale across Canada.
Thank you. And I only have approximately a minute left, so I want to get in one last question to you, Dr. Bryant. In your opening remarks, you had made some suggestions about amendments that could be proposed to C-21, and you did make mention of the possibility of using the firearms that were listed in both Amendment G46, but also codified by G4, as moving that classification to a restricted category. I know you had a little bit of an exchange on this with Mr. Lloyd, but can you just maybe add a little bit onto that? Like, by a restricted category, what does that mean to the firearm owner? What additional safety steps are in place for the classification of a restricted firearm? And I'm also assuming that an exemption might have to be needed to allow some of those firearms to be used in a hunting purposes, because currently restricted firearms can only legally travel between your home and the range, or a special authorization is needed if you're moving places of residence.
Yes. So If they were restricted firearms, then first of all, they would be registered. So currently, many but not all of the firearms that are under discussion here are registered. This would ensure that they would all be registered. That would mean that chief firearms officers would have some greater degree of control over who was allowed to possess them in particular jurisdictions. It also means that those firearms would be, you would have to have a restricted firearms license in order to own them. That involves an additional step. It means, so for example, in the case of situations where there are allegations of spousal violence, that those firearms could be removed from the home. I would hasten to point out, actually, that we take a very aggressive stance on spousal violence issues in Alberta, particularly since I took over.
Sorry, Doctor, I have to cut you off there.
Okay, thank you.
We have heard a lot of statements repeatedly about assault-style firearms, about large-capacity magazines. We know magazines that are pinned higher than 5 are already prohibited in this country and have been for a while. We've heard automatic style. Right, we had a witness at our committee this past Tuesday that mentioned automatic assault style rifles. We've heard it again today. We've got assault style rifles being mentioned, and I'm really concerned about the use of that terminology consistently, leaving Canadians to believe that we have automatic rifles legal in this country. And there's no clear definition of what is an assault style rifle, and it's what's even more troubling is this same nonsensical, undefined terminology has been repeated by this government when they refer to the May 2020 Modern Council military-style assault weapons that they want to prohibit. Now, G4, in my opinion, was a failed attempt to redefine what makes a firearm prohibited. And which included, semi-automatic hunting rifles and shotguns. And as my colleague, Mr. Lloyd, has said, that a gun should be classified on what it does, what it's capable of, not by what it looks like. So, Dr. Bryant, with your expertise in this area, can you set the record straight for us? For Canadians who don't know, what is an automatic firearm? Are they legal in Canada? When were they prohibited? What is a military-style assault weapon? And do you think it's ludicrous that a government would invent a term and then try to find a definition for it, including firearms that may fit into that definition?
Okay, thank you. So, first of all, fully automatic firearms are firearms where when one pulls the trigger, the firearm continues to discharge as long as there's ammunition. So basically what most people would call a machine gun. Those have been illegal for private individuals to have since 77, 78, the approximate year. And there are a tiny number of people who still own them because they were grandfathered at the time, but those people are now extremely old. And so, well, even older than me, so I call that extremely old. Then your question about what would be an assault-style firearm would be a fully automatic firearm with that fires an intermediate power cartridge. So the original assault rifles, like the German Sturmgewehr or the original fully automatic AK-47s, those are assault firearms. Now, assault style takes it a remote step back, and basically they're suggesting anything that looks like that. But you can buy kits, because some people have different tastes. You can buy a kit that will make a rifle made 150 years ago look like one of those military-style assault firearms, simply by changing the stock, putting some accessories on it. So I'm not sure that I got all of your question. It was fairly long.
So we've heard the government talk. We've heard Dr. Bryant, the government, speak about military-style assault weapons. Is that what you're referring to when you define them as a one pull of the trigger, continuous fire until they're out of ammunition. So that's what they say they're trying to prohibit. Have they hit the mark with their prohibitions in this country, or proposed prohibitions that they're banning military-style assault weapons that really don't exist anyway legally?
Well, what I defined was an assault weapon. The term, as I suggested, military style is, it's sort of like being, is that a modern style of a suit or a modern style of car? It's sort of, it's much is in the eye of the beholder. And so it's pretty much a meaningless term. And so it is, as you've suggested before, somewhat ludicrous to create a term and then create a definition to try and match that term.
In your opinion, Dr. Bryant, will prohibiting hunting rifles and shotguns, as was previously planned in G4, which the government is still trying to find a definition for, of the firearms they want to prohibit, and that were listed in G46, will that have any measurable, even with the full list that they had proposed initially, will that have any measurable impact, positive impact on public safety in this country?
The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is what's important is not what kind of a gun someone has. It's whether they're allowed to have a gun at all. And that's why in Alberta we have focused on improving our screening process, including having subject matter experts on spousal violence, including greater training on a wide range of factors to ensure that anyone who gets a firearms license deserves to have one, and why we are ramping up our staffing to ensure prompter attention to any cases, those rare cases where someone who has a license becomes a person who shouldn't have a license, that we can follow up on that promptly in order to ensure public safety.
Thank you, Mr. Motz.
Ms. Bryant, you were appointed by the government of Alberta as firearm officer to defend the rights of firearms owners. In an article by Radio Canada from November of 2022, and referring to the G4 amendment, you said that the amendment would have an impact on hunters and recreational users, and adding that almost all firearms can be used for hunting. To your knowledge, currently in Canada, how many firearm brands are out there for hunting? Are we talking 100, a couple hundred, thousands? Do we have an idea of how many firearms are out there that can be used for hunting on the market, to your knowledge? I think there are thousands of models. There is a reference table on firearms that categorizes those firearms. There are thousands on the list. There are a lot of models that could be used unless the law forbids their use. So the question, it was a little hard to be specific, but there are at least thousands. I understand. Thank you very much. That gives us a good idea. When the amendments were tabled, it created a lot of surprise and generated a lot of discussion in my riding. There were hunters who were worried that their firearms would be on the list of prohibited firearms. Some hunters told me, well, if my firearm ends up on that list, well, then I'll buy another one, quite simply. And so they weren't too worried. After having understood the amendments, because they were a little tricky to understand, but one can understand there are about 400 or 500 firearm brands that would be prohibited. And among them, only about 10 or so are regularly used for hunting. With these 480 models, do you think that firearms will remain on the market that could be used for hunting? Is that what you understand? Taking into account the number you cited earlier. There will certainly be models that can be used for hunting, but not all firearms are equal. Each person has their own specific needs, and quite often what we find is that a firearm meets the specific needs of that person, but the other firearms don't. And that's why there are thousands of models.
Perfect.